Part 1, Chapter 3 of The Man of Property. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kirsten Ferreri. The Forsyte Saga. The Man of Property by John Galsworthy. Part 1, Chapter 3. Dinner at Swithin's. In Swithin's orange and light blue dining room, facing the park, the round table was laid for 12. A cut-glass chandelier filled with lighted candles hung like a giant stalactite above its centre, radiating over large gilt-framed mirrors, slabs of marble on the tops of side tables, and heavy gold chairs with crewel-worked seats. Everything betokened that love of beauty so deeply implanted in each family which has had its own way to make into society, out of the more vulgar heart of nature. Swithin had indeed an impatience of simplicity, a love of ormolu, which had always stamped him amongst his associates as a man of great, if somewhat luxurious tastes, and out of the knowledge that no one could possibly enter his rooms without perceiving him to be a man of wealth, he had derived a solid and prolonged happiness, such as, perhaps, no other circumstance in life had afforded him. Since his retirement from land agency, a profession deplorable in his estimation, especially as to its auctioneering department, he had abandoned himself to naturally aristocratic tastes. The perfect luxury of his latter days had embedded him like a fly in sugar, and his mind, where very little took place from morning till night, was the junction of two curiously opposite emotions, a lingering and sturdy satisfaction that he had made his own way and his own fortune, and a sense that a man of his distinction should never have been allowed to soil his mind with work. He stood at the sideboard in a white waistcoat with large gold and onyx buttons, watching his valet screw the necks of 3 champagne bottles deeper into ice-pails. Between the points of his stand-up collar, which, though it hurt him to move, he would on no account have altered, the pale flesh of his under-chin remained immovable. His eyes roved from bottle to bottle. He was debating, and he argued like this: Jolyon drinks a glass, perhaps 2, he's so careful of himself. James, he can't take his wine nowadays. Nicholas, Fanny and he would swill water, he shouldn't wonder. Soames didn't count. These young nephews, Soames was 31, couldn't drink. But Bosinney? Encountering in the name of this stranger something outside the range of his philosophy, Swithin paused. A misgiving arose in him. It was impossible to tell. June was only a girl, and in love too. Emily, Mrs. James, liked a good glass of champagne. It was too dry for Julie, poor old soul, she had no palate. As to Hattie Chessman, the thought of this old friend caused a cloud of thought to obscure the perfect glassiness of his eyes. He shouldn't wonder if she drank half a bottle. But in thinking of his remaining guest, an expression like that of a cat who is just going to purr stole over his old face. Mrs. Soames! She mightn't take much, but she would appreciate what she drank. It was a pleasure to give her good wine. A pretty woman, and sympathetic to him. The thought of her was like champagne itself. A pleasure to give a good wine to a young woman who looked so well, who knew how to dress, with charming manners, quite distinguished. A pleasure to entertain her. Between the points of his collar he gave his head the first small, painful oscillation of the evening. "Adolphe," he said, "put in another bottle." He himself might drink a good deal, for, thanks to that prescription of Blight's, he found himself extremely well, and he had been careful to take no lunch. He had not felt so well for weeks. Puffing out his lower lip, he gave his last instructions. "Adolphe, the least touch of the West India when you come to the ham." Passing into the anteroom, he sat down on the edge of a chair with his knees apart, and his tall, bulky form was wrapped at once in an expectant, strange, primeval immobility. He was ready to rise at a moment's notice. He had not given a dinner party for months. This dinner, in honour of June's engagement, had seemed a bore at first. Among Forsytes the custom of solemnizing engagements by feasts was religiously observed, but the labours of sending invitations and ordering the repast over, he felt pleasantly stimulated. And thus sitting, a watch in his hand, fat and smooth and golden like a flattened globe of butter, he thought of nothing. A long man with side whiskers, who had once been in Swithin's service but was now a greengrocer, entered and proclaimed, "Mrs. Chessman, Mrs. Septimus Small." Two ladies advanced. The one in front, habited entirely in red, had large settled patches of the same colour in her cheeks, and a hard, dashing eye. She walked at Swithin, holding out a hand cased in a long primrose-coloured glove. "Well, Swithin," she said, "I haven't seen you for ages. How are you? Why, my dear boy, how stout you're getting!" The fixity of Swithin's eye alone betrayed emotion. A dumb and grumbling anger swelled his bosom. It was vulgar to be stout, to talk of being stout. He had a chest, nothing more. Turning to his sister, he grasped her hand and said in a tone of command, "Well, Julie?" Mrs. Septimus Small was the tallest of the four sisters. Her good round old face had gone a little sour. An innumerable pout clung all over it, as if it had been encased in an iron wire mask up to that evening, which, being suddenly removed, left little rolls of mutinous flesh all over her countenance. Even her eyes were pouting. It was thus that she recorded her permanent resentment at the loss of Septimus Small. She had quite a reputation for saying the wrong thing, and, tenacious like all her breed, she would hold to it when she had said it, and add to it another wrong thing, and so on. With the decease of her husband, the family tenacity, the family matter-of-factness, had gone sterile within her. A great talker when aloud, she would converse without the faintest animation for hours together, relating with epic monotony the innumerable occasions on which fortune had misused her, nor did she ever perceive that her hearers sympathized with fortune, for her heart was kind. Having sat, poor soul, long by the bedside of Small, a man of poor constitution, she had acquired the habit, and there were countless subsequent occasions when she had sat immense periods of time to amuse sick people, children, and other helpless persons, and she could never divest herself of the feeling that the world was the most ungrateful place anybody could live in. Sunday after Sunday she sat at the feet of that extremely witty preacher, the Reverend Thomas Scholes, who exercised a great influence over her, but she succeeded in convincing everybody that even this was a misfortune. She had passed into a proverb in the family, and when anybody was observed to be peculiarly distressing, he was known as a regular Julie. The habit of her mind would have killed anybody but a Forsyte at 40, but she was 72, and had never looked better, and one felt that there were capacities for enjoyment about her which might yet come out. She owned 3 canaries, the cat Tommy, and half a parrot, in common with her sister Hester, and these poor creatures, kept carefully out of Timothy's way, he was nervous about animals, unlike human beings, recognizing that she could not help being blighted, attached themselves to her passionately. She was sombrely magnificent this evening in black bombazine, with a mauve front cut in a shy triangle, and crowned with a black velvet ribbon round the base of her thin throat. Black and mauve for evening wear was esteemed very chaste by nearly every Forsyte. Pouting at Swithin, she said, "Anne has been asking for you. You haven't been near us for an age." Swithin put his thumbs within the armholes of his waistcoat, and replied, "Anne's getting very shaky. She ought to have a doctor." "Mr. and Mrs. Nicholas Forsyte." Nicholas Forsyte, cocking his rectangular eyebrows, wore a smile. He had succeeded during the day in bringing to fruition a scheme for the employment of a tribe from Upper India in the gold mines of Ceylon. A pet plan, carried at last in the teeth of great difficulties. He was justly pleased. It would double the output of his mines, and as he had often forcibly argued, all experience tended to show that a man must die, and whether he died a miserable old age in his own country, or prematurely of damp in the bottom of a foreign mine, was surely of little consequence, provided that by a change in his mode of life he benefited the British Empire. His ability was undoubted. Raising his broken nose toward his listener, he would add, "For want of a few hundred of these fellows, we haven't paid a dividend for years, and look at the price of the shares. I can't get 10 shillings for them." He had been at Yarmouth too, and had come back feeling that he had added at least 10 years to his own life. He grasped Swithin's hand, exclaiming in a jocular voice, "Well, so here we are again." Mrs. Nicholas, an effete woman, smiled a smile of frightened jollity behind his back. "Mr. and Mrs. James Forsyte. Mr. and Mrs. Soames Forsyte." Swithin drew his heels together, his deportment ever admirable. "Well, James, well, Emily, how are you, Soames? How do you do?" His hand enclosed Irene's, and his eyes swelled. She was a pretty woman. A little too pale, but her figure, her eyes, her teeth, too good for that chap Soames. The gods had given Irene dark brown eyes and golden hair, that strange combination, provocative of men's glances, which is said to be the mark of a weak character. And the full soft pallor of her neck and shoulders, above a gold-coloured frock, gave to her personality an alluring strangeness. Soames stood behind, his eyes fastened on his wife's neck. The hands of Swithin's watch, which he still held open in his hand, had left 8 behind. It was half an hour beyond his dinner time. He had had no lunch, and a strange primeval impatience surged up within him. "It's not like Jolyon to be late," he said to Irene, with uncontrollable vexation. "I suppose it'll be June keeping him." "People in love are always late," she answered. Swithin stared at her. A dusky orange dyed his cheeks. "They have no business to be. Some fashionable nonsense." And behind this outburst, the inarticulate violence of primitive generations seemed to mutter and grumble. "Tell me what you think of my new star, Uncle Swithin," said Irene softly. Among the lace in the bosom of her dress was shining a 5-pointed star, made of 11 diamonds. Swithin looked at the star. He had a pretty taste in stones. No question could have been more sympathetically devised to distract his attention. "Who gave you that?" he asked. "Soames." There was no change in her face, but Swithin's pale eyes bulged as though he might suddenly have been afflicted with insight. "I daresay you're dull at home," he said. "Any day you like to come and dine with me, I'll give you as good a bottle of wine as you'll get in London. Miss June Forsyte, Mr. Jolyon Forsyte, Mr. Bosinney." Swithin moved his arm, and said in a rumbling voice, "Dinner, now! Dinner!" He took in Irene on the ground that he had not entertained her since she was a bride. June was the portion of Bosinney, who was placed between Irene and his fiancée. On the other side of June was James with Mrs. Nicholas, then Old Jolyon with Mrs. James, Nicholas with Hattie Chessman, Soames with Mrs. Small, completing the circle to Swithin again. Family dinners of the Forsytes observe certain traditions. There are, for instance, no hors d'oeuvre. The reason for this is unknown. Theory among the younger members traces it to the disgraceful price of oysters. It is more probably due to a desire to come to the point, to a good practical sense deciding at once that hors d'oeuvres are but poor things. The Jameses alone, unable to withstand a custom almost universal in Park Lane, are now and then unfaithful. A silent, almost morose inattention to each other succeeds to the subsidence into their seats, lasting till well into the first entree, but interspersed with remarks such as, "Tom's bad again. I can't tell what's the matter with him. I suppose Anne doesn't come down in the mornings. What's the name of your doctor, Fanny? Stubbs? He's a quack. Winifred, she's got too many children. 4, isn't it? She's as thin as a lath. What do you give for this sherry, Swithin? Too dry for me." With the second glass of champagne, a kind of hum makes itself heard, which, when divested of casual accessories and resolved into its primal element, is found to be James telling a story. And this goes on for a long time, encroaching sometimes even upon what must universally be recognized as the crowning point of a Forsyte feast, the saddle of mutton. No Forsyte has given a dinner without providing a saddle of mutton. There is something in its succulent solidity which makes it suitable to people of a certain position. It is nourishing and tasty, the sort of thing a man remembers eating. It has a past and a future, like a deposit paid into a bank, and it is something that can be argued about. Each branch of the family tenaciously held to a particular locality. Old Jolyon swearing by Dartmoor, James by Welsh, Swithin by Southdown, Nicholas maintaining that people might sneer but there was nothing like New Zealand. As for Roger, the original of the brothers, he had been obliged to invent a locality of his own, and with an ingenuity worthy of a man who had devised a new profession for his sons, he had discovered a shop where they sold German. On being remonstrated with, he had proved his point by producing a butcher's bill, which showed that he paid more than any of the others. It was on this occasion that old Jolyon, turning to June, had said in one of his bursts of philosophy, "You may depend upon it they're a cranky lot, the Forsytes, and you'll find it out as you grow older." Timothy alone held apart, for though he ate saddle of mutton heartily, he was, he said, afraid of it. To anyone interested psychologically in Forsytes, this great saddle of mutton trait is of prime importance. Not only does it illustrate their tenacity, both collectively and as individuals, but it marks them as belonging in fibre and instincts to the great class which believes in nourishment and flavour, and yields to no sentimental craving for beauty. Younger members of the family, indeed, would have done without a joint altogether, preferring guinea fowl or lobster salad, something which appealed to the imagination and had less nourishment. But these were females, or if not, had been corrupted by their wives or by mothers, who, having been forced to eat saddle of mutton throughout their married lives, had passed a secret hostility towards it into the fibre of their sons. The great saddle of mutton controversy at an end, a Tewkesbury ham commenced, together with the least touch of West Indian. Swithin was so long over this course that he caused a block in the progress of the dinner. To devote himself to it with better heart, he paused in his conversation. From his seat by Mrs. Septimus Small, Soames was watching. He had a reason of his own connected with a pet building scheme for observing Bosinney. The architect might do for his purpose. He looked clever as he sat leaning back in his chair, moodily making little ramparts with breadcrumbs. Soames noted his dress clothes to be well cut, but too small, as though made many years ago. He saw him turn to Irene and say something, and her face sparkle as he often saw it sparkle at other people, never at himself. He tried to catch what they were saying, but Aunt Juley was speaking. Hadn't that always seemed very extraordinary to Soames? Only last Sunday dear Mr. Scole had been so witty in his sermon, so sarcastic. For what, he had said, shall it profit a man if he gain his own soul, but lose all his property? That, he had said, was the motto of the middle class. Now, what had he meant by that? Of course, it might be what middle-class people believed. She didn't know. What did Soames think? He answered abstractedly, "How should I know? Scholes is a humbug, though, isn't he?" For Bosinney was looking around the table as if pointing out the peculiarities of the guests, and Soames wondered what he was saying. By her smile, Irene was evidently agreeing with his remarks. She seemed always to agree with other people. Her eyes were turned on himself. Soames dropped his glance at once. The smile had died off her lips. A humbug? But what did Soames mean? If Mr. Scholes was a humbug, a clergyman, then anybody might be. It was frightful. "Well, and so they are," said Soames. During Aunt Juley's momentary and horrified silence, he caught some words of Irene's that sounded like, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." But Swithin had finished his ham. "Where do you go for your mushrooms?" he was saying to Irene, in a voice like a courtier's. "You ought to go to Smiley Bob's. He'll give 'em you fresh. These little men, they won't take the trouble." Irene turned to answer him, and Soames saw Bosinney watching her and smiling to himself. A curious smile the fellow had, a half-simple arrangement, like a child who smiles when he is pleased. As for George's nickname, the Buccaneer, he did not think too much of that. And seeing Bosinney turn to June, Soames smiled too, but sardonically. He did not like June, who was not looking too pleased. This was not surprising, for she had just held the following conversation with James. "I stayed on the river on my way home, Uncle James, and saw a beautiful site for a house." James, a slow and thorough eater, stopped the process of mastication. "Eh?" he said. "Now where was that?" "Close to Pangbourne." James placed a piece of ham in his mouth, and June waited. "I suppose you wouldn't know whether the land about there was all freehold?" he asked at last. "You wouldn't know anything about the price of land about there?" "Yes," said June, "I made enquiries." Her little resolute face under its copper crown was suspiciously eager and aglow. James regarded her with the air of an inquisitor. "What? You're not thinking of buying land?" he ejaculated, dropping his fork. June was greatly encouraged by his interest. It had long been her pet plan that her uncles should benefit themselves and Bosinney by building country houses. "Of course not," she said. "I thought it would be such a splendid place for you or someone to build a country house." James looked at her sideways, and placed a second piece of ham in his mouth. "Land ought to be very dear about there," he said. What June had taken for personal interest was only the impersonal excitement of every Forsyte who hears of something eligible in danger of passing into other hands. But she refused to see the disappearance of her chance, and continued to press her point. You ought to go into the country, Uncle James. I wish I had a lot of money. I wouldn't live another day in London." James was stirred to the depths of his long, thin figure. He had no idea his niece held such downright views. "Why don't you go into the country?" repeated June. "It would do you a lot of good." "Why," began James in a fluster, "buying land. What good do you suppose I can do buying land, building houses? I couldn't get 4% for my money." "What does that matter? You'd get fresh air." "Fresh air!" exclaimed James. "What should I do with fresh air?" "I should have thought anybody liked to have fresh air," said June scornfully. James wiped his napkin all over his mouth. "You don't know the value of money." "No, and I hope I never shall." And biting her lip with inexpressible mortification, poor June was silent. Why were her own relations so rich, and Phil never knew where the money was coming from for tomorrow's tobacco? Why couldn't they do something for him? But they were so selfish. Why couldn't they build country houses? She had all that naive dogmatism which is so pathetic, and sometimes achieves such great results. Bosinney, to whom she turned in her discomfiture, was talking to Irene, and a chill fell on June's spirit. Her eyes grew steady with anger, like old Jolyon's when his will was crossed. James, too, was much disturbed. He felt as though someone had threatened his right to invest his money at 5%. Jolyon had spoiled her. None of his girls would have said such a thing. James had always been exceedingly liberal to his children, and the consciousness of this made him feel it all the more deeply. He trifled moodily with his strawberries. Then, deluging them with cream, he ate them quickly. They, at all events, should not escape him. No wonder he was upset. Engaged for 54 years, he had been admitted as solicitor on the earliest day sanctioned by the law, in arranging mortgages, preserving investments at a dead level of high and safe interest, conducting negotiations on the principle of securing the utmost possible out of other people compatible with safety to his clients and himself, in calculations as to the exact pecuniary possibilities of all the relations of life, he had come at last to think purely in terms of money. Money was now his light, his medium for seeing, that without which he was really unable to see, really not cognizant of phenomena. And to have this thing, "I hope I shall never know the value of money," said to his face, saddened and exasperated him. He knew it to be nonsense, or it would have frightened him. What was the world coming to? Suddenly recollecting the story of young Jolyon, however, he felt a little comforted, for what could you expect with a father like that? This turned his thoughts into a channel still less pleasant. What was all this talk about Soames and Irene? As in all self-respecting families, an emporium had been established where family secrets were bartered and family stock priced. It was known on Forsyte 'Change that Irene regretted her marriage. Her regret was disapproved of. She ought to have known her own mind. No dependable woman made these mistakes. James reflected sourly that they had a nice house, rather small, in an excellent position, no children and no money troubles. Soames was reserved about his affairs, but he must be getting a very warm man. He had a capital income from the business, for Soames, like his father, was a member of that well-known firm of solicitors, Forsyte, Bustard and Forsyte, and had always been very careful. He had done unusually well with some mortgages he had taken up, too, a little timely foreclosure, most lucky hits. There was no reason why Irene should not be happy, yet they said she had been asking for a separate room. He knew where that ended. It wasn't as if Soames drank. James looked at his daughter-in-law. That unseen glance of his was cold and dubious. Appeal and fear were in it, and a sense of personal grievance. Why should he be worried like this? It was so very likely all nonsense. Women were funny things. They exaggerated so you didn't know what to believe. And then nobody told him anything. He had to find everything out for himself. Again he looked furtively at Irene, and across from her to Soames. The latter, listening to Aunt Juley, was looking up under his brows in the direction of Bosinney. "He's fond of her, I know," thought James. "Look at the way he's always giving her things." And the extraordinary unreasonableness of her disaffection struck him with increased force. It was a pity, too. She was a taking little thing, and he, James, would really be quite fond of her if she'd only let him. She had taken up lately with June. That was doing her no good. That was certainly doing her no good. She was getting to have opinions of her own. He didn't know what she wanted with anything of the sort. She had a good home, and everything she could wish for. He felt that her friends ought to be chosen for her. To go on like this was dangerous. June, indeed, with her habit of championing the unfortunate, had dragged from Irene a confession, and in return had preached the necessity of facing the evil by separation if need be. But in the face of these exhortations, Irene had kept a brooding silence, as though she found terrible the thought of this struggle carried through in cold blood. He would never give her up, she had said to June. "Who cares?" June cried. "Let him do what he likes. You have only to stick to it." And she had not scrupled to say something of this sort at Timothy's. James, when he heard of it, had felt a natural indignation and horror. What if Irene were to take it into her head to—he could hardly frame the thought—to leave Soames? But he felt this thought so unbearable that he at once put it away. The shady visions it conjured up, the sound of family tongues buzzing in his ears, the horror of the conspicuous happening so close to him, to one of his own children. Luckily she had no money, a beggarly £50 a year, and he thought of the deceased heron who had had nothing to give her, with contempt. Brooding over his glass, his long legs twisted under the table, he quite omitted to rise when the ladies left the room. He would have to speak to Soames, would have to put him on his guard. They could not go on like this, now that such a contingency had occurred to him. And he noticed, with sour disfavour, that June had left her wine-glasses full of wine. "That little thing's at the bottom of it all," he mused. "Irene would never have thought of it herself. James was a man of imagination." The voice of Swithin roused him from his reverie. "I gave £400 for it," he was saying. "Of course it's a regular work of art." "400? That's a lot of money," chimed in Nicholas. The object alluded to was an elaborate group of statuary in Italian marble, which, placed upon a lofty stand, also of marble, diffused an atmosphere of culture throughout the room. The subsidiary figures, of which there were 6, female, nude, and of highly ornate workmanship, were all pointing toward the central figure, also nude and female, who was pointing at herself, and all this gave the observer a very pleasant sense of her extreme value. Aunt Juley, nearly opposite, had had the greatest difficulty in not looking at it all the evening. Old Jolyon spoke. It was he who had started the discussion. "400 fiddlesticks! Don't tell me you gave 400 for that!" Between the points of his collar, Swithin's chin made the second painful oscillatory movement of the evening. £400 of English money, not a farthing less. I don't regret it. It's not common English, it's genuine modern Italian." Soames raised the corner of his lip in a smile, and looked across at Bosinney. The architect was grinning behind the fumes of his cigarette. Now, indeed, he looked more like a buccaneer. "There's a lot of work about it," remarked James hastily, who was really moved by the size of the group. "It'd sell well at Jobson's." "The poor foreign deyvle that made it," went on Swithin, "asked me 500. I gave him 4. It's worth 8. Looked half-starved, poor deyvle." "Ah!" chimed in Nicholas suddenly. "Poor, seedy-looking chaps, these artists. It's a wonder to me how they live. Now there's young Flageoletti, that Fanny and the girls were always having in, to play the fiddle. If he makes 100 a year, it's as much as he ever does." James shook his head. "Ah," he said, "I don't know how they live." Old Jolyon had risen, and, cigar in mouth, went to inspect the group at close quarters. "Wouldn't have given 2 for it," he pronounced at last. Soames saw his father and Nicholas glance at each other anxiously, and on the other side of Swithin, Bosinney, still shrouded in smoke. "I wonder what he thinks of it," thought Soames, who knew well enough that this group was hopelessly vieux, hopelessly of the last generation. There was no longer any sale at Jobson's for such works of art. Swithin's answer came at last. "You never knew anything about a statue. You've got your pictures, and that's all." Old Jolyon walked back to his seat, puffing his cigar. It was not likely that he was going to be drawn into an argument with an obstinate beggar like Swithin, pig-headed as a mule, who had never known a statue from a straw hat. "Stucco," was all he said. It had long been physically impossible for Swithin to start. His fist came down on the table. "Stucco! I should like to see anything you've got in your house half as good." And behind his speech seemed to sound again that rumbling violence of primitive generations. It was James who saved the situation. "Now what do you say, Mr. Bosinney? You're an architect. You ought to know all about statues and things." Every eye was turned upon Bosinney. All waited with a strange, suspicious look for his answer. And Soames, speaking for the first time, asked, "Yes, Bosinney, what do you say?" Bosinney replied coolly, "The work is a remarkable one." His words were addressed to Swithin. His eyes smiled slyly at Old Jolyon. Only Soames remained unsatisfied. "Remarkable for what?" "For its naivety." The answer was followed by an impressive silence. Swithin alone was not sure whether a compliment was intended. End of Part 1, Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of The Man of Property. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kirsten Ferreri. The Forsyte Saga. The Man of Property by John Galsworthy. Part 1, Chapter 4. Projection of the House. Soames Forsyte walked out of his green-painted front door 3 days after the dinner at Swithin's, and looking back from across the square, confirmed his impression that his house wanted painting. He had left his wife sitting on the sofa in the drawing-room, her hands crossed in her lap, manifestly waiting for him to go out. This was not unusual. It happened, in fact, every day. He could not understand what she found wrong with him. It was not as if he drank. Did he run into debt, or gamble, or swear? Was he violent? Were his friends rackety? Did he stay out at night? On the contrary. The profound, subdued aversion which he felt in his wife was a mystery to him, and a source of the most terrible irritation. That she had made a mistake, and did not love him, had tried to love him, and could not love him, was obviously no reason. He that could imagine so outlandish a cause for his wife's not getting on with him was certainly no Forsyte. Soames was forced, therefore, to set the blame entirely down to his wife. He had never met a woman so capable of inspiring affection. They could not go anywhere without his seeing how all the men were attracted by her. Their looks, manners, voices betrayed it. Her behaviour under this attention had been beyond reproach. That she was one of those women, not too common in the Anglo-Saxon race, born to be loved and to love, who when not loving are not living, had certainly never even occurred to him. Her power of attraction he regarded as part of her value as his property, but it made him indeed suspect that she could give as well as receive, and she gave him nothing. Then why did she marry me, was his continual thought. He had forgotten his courtship, that year and a half when he had besieged and lain in wait for her, devising schemes for her entertainment, giving her presents, proposing to her periodically, and keeping her other admirers away with his perpetual presence. He had forgotten the day when, adroitly taking advantage of an acute phase of her dislike to her home surroundings, he crowned his labours with success. If he remembered anything, it was the dainty capriciousness with which the gold-haired, dark-eyed girl had treated him. He certainly did not remember the look on her face, strange, passive, and appealing, when suddenly one day she had yielded, and said that she would marry him. It had been one of those real devoted wooings which books and people praise, when the lover is at length rewarded for hammering the iron till it is malleable, and all must be happy ever after as the wedding bells. Soames walked eastward, mousing doggedly along on the shady side. The house wanted doing up, unless he decided to move into the country and build. For the 100th time that month he turned over this problem. There was no use in rushing into things. He was very comfortably off, with an increasing income getting on for £3,000 a year, but his invested capital was not perhaps so large as his father believed. James had a tendency to expect that his children should be better off than they were. I can manage £8,000 easily enough, he thought, without calling in either Robertsons or Nichols. He had stopped to look in at a picture shop, for Soames was an amateur of pictures, and had a little room in No. 62 Montpellier Square, full of canvases stacked against the wall, which he had no room to hang. He brought them home with him on his way back from the city, generally after dark, and would enter this room on Sunday afternoons to spend hours turning the pictures to the light, examining the marks on their backs, and occasionally making notes. They were nearly all landscapes with figures in the foreground, a sign of some mysterious revolt against London, its tall houses, its interminable streets, where his life and the lives of his breed and class were passed. Every now and then he would take 1 or 2 pictures away with him in a cab, and stop at Jobson's on his way into the city. He rarely showed them to anyone. Irene, whose opinion he secretly respected, and perhaps for that reason never solicited, had only been into the room on rare occasions, in discharge of some wifely duty. She was not asked to look at the pictures, and she never did. To Soames this was another grievance. He hated that pride of hers, and secretly dreaded it. In the plate-glass window of the picture shop his image stood and looked at him. His sleek hair under the brim of the tall hat had a sheen like the hat itself. His cheeks, pale and flat, the line of his clean-shaven lips, his firm chin with its greyish-shaven tinge, and the buttoned strictness of his black cut-away coat conveyed an appearance of reserve and secrecy, of imperturbable, enforced composure. But his eyes, cold, grey, strained-looking, with a line in the brow between them, examined him wistfully, as if they knew of a secret weakness. He noted the subjects of the pictures, the names of the painters, made a calculation of their values, but without the satisfaction he usually derived from this inward appraisement, and walked on. Number 62 would do well enough for another year if he decided to build. The times were good for building, money had not been so dear for years, and the sight he had seen at Robin Hill, when he had gone down there in the spring to inspect the nickel mortgage, what could be better? Within 12 miles of Hyde Park Corner, the value of the land certain to go up would always fetch more than he gave for it, so that a house, if built in really good style, was a first-class investment. The notion of being the one member of his family with a country house weighed but little with him, for to a true Forsyte, sentiment, even the sentiment of social position, was a luxury only to be indulged in after his appetite for more material pleasure had been satisfied. To get Irene out of London, away from opportunities of going about and seeing people, away from her friends, and those who put ideas into her head, that was the thing. She was too thick with June. June disliked him, and he returned the sentiment. They were of the same blood. It would be everything to get Irene out of town. The house would please her. She would enjoy messing about with the decoration. She was very artistic. The house must be in good style, something that would always be certain to command a price, something unique, like that last house of Parkes which had a tower. But Parkes himself had said that his architect was ruinous. You never knew where you were with these fellows. If they had a name, they ran you into no end of expense, and were conceited into the bargain. And a common architect was no good. The memory of Parkes's tower precluded the employment of a common architect. This was why he had thought of Bosinney. Since the dinner at Swithin's he had made enquiries, the result of which had been meagre but encouraging. One of the new school. Clever? As clever as you like. A bit up in the air. He had not been able to discover what houses Bosinney had built, nor what his charges were. The impression he gathered was that he would be able to make his own terms. The more he reflected on the idea, the more he liked it. It would be keeping the thing in the family, with Forsytes almost an instinct, and he would be able to get favoured nation, if not nominal terms. Only fair, considering the chance to Bosinney of displaying his talents, for this house must be no common edifice. Soames reflected complacently on the work it would be sure to bring the young man, for, like every Forsyte, he could be a thorough optimist when there was anything to be had out of it. Bosinney's office was in Sloane Street, close at hand, so that he would be able to keep his eye continually on the plans. Again, Irene would not be likely to object to leave London if her greatest friend's lover were given the job. June's marriage might depend on it. Irene could not decently stand in the way of June's marriage. She would never do that, he knew her too well, and June would be pleased. Of this he saw the advantage. Bosinney looked clever, but he had also, and it was one of his great attractions, an air as if he did not quite know on which side his bread were buttered. He should be easy to deal with in money matters. Soames made this reflection in no defrauding spirit. It was the natural attitude of his mind, of the mind of any good business man, of all those thousands of good business men through whom he was threading his way up Ludgate Hill. Thus he fulfilled the inscrutable laws of his great class, of human nature itself, when he reflected with a sense of comfort that Bosinney would be easy to deal with in money matters. While he elbowed his way on, his eyes, which he usually kept fixed on the ground before his feet, were attracted upwards by the dome of St. Paul's. It had a peculiar fascination for him, that old dome, and not once but twice or three times a week would he halt in his daily pilgrimage to enter beneath and stop in the side aisles for 5 or 10 minutes, scrutinizing the names and epitaphs on the monuments. The attraction for him of this great church was inexplicable, unless it enabled him to concentrate his thoughts on the business of the day. If any affair of particular movement, or demanding peculiar acuteness, was weighing on his mind, he invariably went in to wander with mouse-like attention from epitaph to epitaph. Then, retiring in the same noiseless way, he would hold steadily on up Cheapside, a thought more of dogged purpose in his gait, as though he had seen something which he had made up his mind to buy. He went in this morning, but instead of stealing from monument to monument, turned his eyes upward to the columns and spacings of the walls, and remained motionless. His uplifted face, with the odd and wistful look which faces take on themselves in church, was whitened to a chalky hue in the vast building. His gloved hands were clasped in front over the handle of his umbrella. He lifted them. Some sacred inspiration perhaps had come to him. Yes, he thought, I must have room to hang my pictures. That evening, on his return from the city, he called at Bosinney's office. He found the architect in his shirt-sleeves, smoking a pipe and ruling off lines on a plan. Soames refused a drink and came at once to the point. "If you've nothing better to do on Sunday, come down with me to Robin Hill and give me your opinion on a building site." "Are you going to build?" "Perhaps," said Soames, "but don't speak of it. I just want your opinion." "Quite so," said the architect. Soames peered about the room. "You're rather high up here," he remarked. Any information he could gather about the nature and scope of Bosinney's business would be all to the good. "It does well enough for me so far," answered the architect. "You're accustomed to the swells." He knocked out his pipe, but replaced it empty between his teeth. It assisted him, perhaps, to carry on the conversation. Soames noted a hollow in each cheek, made as it were by suction. "What do you pay for an office like this?" said he. "50 too much," replied Bosinney. This answer impressed Soames favourably. "I suppose it is dear," he said. "I'll call for you on Sunday about 11." The following Sunday, therefore, he called for Bosinney in a hansom, and drove him to the station. On arriving at Robin Hill they found no cab, and started to walk the 1.5 miles to the site. It was the 1st of August, a perfect day with a burning sun and cloudless sky, and in the straight narrow road leading up the hill their feet kicked up a yellow dust. "Gravel soil," remarked Soames, and sideways he glanced at the coat Bosinney wore. Into the side pockets of this coat were thrust bundles of papers, and under one arm was carried a queer-looking stick. Soames noticed these and other peculiarities. No one but a clever man, or indeed a buccaneer, would have taken such liberties with his appearance, and though these eccentricities were revolting to Soames, he derived a certain satisfaction from them, as evidence of qualities by which he must inevitably profit. If the fellow could build houses, what did his clothes matter? "I told you," he said, "that I want this house to be a surprise, so don't say anything about it. I never talk of my affairs until they're carried through." Bosinney nodded. "Let women into your plans," pursued Soames, "and you never know where it'll end." "Ah," said Bosinney, "women are the devil." This feeling had long been at the bottom of Soames's heart. He had never, however, put it into words. "Oh," he muttered, "so you're beginning to—" He stopped, but added, with an uncontrollable burst of spite, "June's got a temper of her own. Always had." "A temper is not a bad thing in an angel." Soames had never called Irene an angel. He could not so have violated his best instincts, letting other people into the secret of her value, and giving himself away. He made no reply. They had struck into a half-made road across a warren. A cart track led at right angles to a gravel pit, beyond which the chimneys of a cottage rose amongst a clump of trees at the border of a thick wood. Tussocks of feathery grass covered the rough surface of the ground, and out of these the larks soared into the height of sunshine. On the far horizon, over a countless succession of fields and hedges, rose a line of downs. Soames led till they had crossed to the far side, and there he stopped. It was the chosen site, but now that he was about to divulge the spot to another, he had become uneasy. "The agent lives in that cottage," he said. "He'll give us some lunch. We'd better have lunch before we go into this matter." He again took the lead to the cottage, where the agent, a tall man named Oliver, with a heavy face and grizzled beard, welcomed them. During lunch, which Soames hardly touched, he kept looking at Bosinney, and once or twice passed his silk handkerchief stealthily over his forehead. The meal came to an end at last, and Bosinney rose. "I dare say you've got business to talk over," he said. "I'll just go and nose about a bit." Without waiting for a reply, he strolled off. Soames was solicitor to this estate, and he spent nearly an hour in the agent's company, looking at ground plans and discussing the nickel and other mortgages. It was as it were by an afterthought that he brought up the question of the building site. "Your people," he said, "ought to come down in their price to me, considering that I shall be the first to build." Oliver shook his head. "The site you've fixed on, sir," he said, "is the cheapest we've got. Sites at the top of the slope are dearer by a good bit." "Mind," said Soames, "I've not decided. It's quite possible I shan't build at all. The ground rent's very high." "Well, Mr. Forsyte, I shall be sorry if you go off, and I think you'll make a mistake, sir. There's not a bit of land near London with such a view as this, nor one that's cheaper, all things considered. We have only to advertise to get a mob of people after it." They looked at each other. Their faces said very plainly, "I respect you as a man of business, and you can't expect me to believe a word you say." "Well," repeated Soames, "I haven't made up my mind. The thing will very likely go off." With these words, taking up his umbrella, he put his chilly hand into the agent's, withdrew it without the faintest pressure, and went out into the sun. He walked slowly back towards the site in deep thought. His instinct told him that what the agent had said was true. A cheap site. And the beauty of it was that he knew the agent did not really think it cheap, so that his own intuitive knowledge was a victory over the agent's. "Cheap or not, I mean to have it," he thought. The larks sprang up in front of his feet. The air was full of butterflies. A sweet fragrance rose from the wild grasses. The sappy scent of the bracken stole forth from the wood, where, hidden in the depths, pigeons were cooing, and from afar on the warm breeze came the rhythmic chiming of church bells. Soames walked with his eyes on the ground, his lips opening and closing as though in anticipation of a delicious morsel. But when he arrived at the site, Bosinney was nowhere to be seen. After waiting some little time, he crossed the warren in the direction of the slope. He would have shouted, but dreaded the sound of his voice. The warren was as lonely as a prairie, its silence only broken by the rustle of rabbits bolting to their holes and the song of the larks. Soames, the pioneer leader of the great Forsyte army advancing to civilization of this wilderness, felt his spirit daunted by the loneliness, by the invisible singing, and the hot, sweet air. He had begun to retrace his steps when he at last caught sight of Bosinney. The architect was sprawling under a large oak tree, whose trunk, with a huge spread of bough and foliage, ragged with age, stood on the verge of the rise. Soames had to touch him on the shoulder before he looked up. "Hello, Forsyte," he said. "I've found the very place for your house. Look here." Soames stood and looked. Then he said coldly, "You may be very clever, but this site will cost me half as much again." "Hang the cost, man! Look at the view!" Almost from their feet stretched ripe corn, dipping to a small dark copse beyond. A plain of fields and hedges spread to the distant grey-blue downs. In a silver streak to the right could be seen the line of the river. The sky was so blue, and the sun so bright, that an eternal summer seemed to reign over this prospect. Thistledown floated round them, enraptured by the serenity of the ether. The heat danced over the corn, and pervading all was a soft, insensible hum, like the murmur of bright minutes holding revel between earth and heaven. Soames looked. In spite of himself, something swelled within his breast. To live here, in sight of all this, to be able to point it out to his friends, to talk of it, to possess it. His cheeks flushed. The warmth, the radiance, the glow were sinking into his senses as, 4 years before, Irene's beauty had sunk into his senses, and made him long for her. He stole a glance at Bosinney, whose eyes, the eyes of the coachman's half-tame leopard, seemed running wild over the landscape. The sunlight had caught the promontories of the fellow's face, the bumpy cheekbones, the point of his chin, the vertical ridges above his brow, and Soames watched this rugged, enthusiastic, careless face with an unpleasant feeling. A long, soft ripple of wind flowed over the corn, and brought a puff of warm air into their faces. "I could build you a teaser here," said Bosinney, breaking the silence at last. "I dare say," replied Soames drily. "You haven't got to pay for it." "For about 8,000 I could build you a palace." Soames had become very pale. A struggle was going on within him. He dropped his eyes, and said stubbornly, "I can't afford it." And slowly, with his mousing walk, he led the way back to the first sight. They spent some time there going into particulars of the projected house, and then Soames returned to the agent's cottage. He came out in about half an hour, and joining Bosinney, started for the station. "Well," he said, hardly opening his lips, "I've taken that site of yours after all." And again he was silent, confusedly debating how it was that this fellow, whom by habit he despised, should have overborne his own decision. End of Part 1, Chapter 4.
Part 1, Chapter 5, of The Man of Property. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Forsyte Saga, The Man of Property, by John Galsworthy. Part 1, Chapter 5, A Forsyte Ménage. Like the enlightened thousands of his class and generation in this great city of London, who no longer believe in red velvet chairs and know that groups of modern Italian marble are vieux jeu, Soames Forsyte inhabited a house which did what it could. It owned a copper door knocker of individual design, windows which had been altered to open outwards, hanging flower boxes filled with fuchsias, and at the back, a great feature, a little court tiled with jade green tiles and surrounded by pink hydrangeas in peacock blue tubs. Here, under a parchment-coloured Japanese sunshade covering the whole end, inhabitants or visitors could be screened from the eyes of the curious while they drank tea and examined at their leisure the latest of Soames's little silver boxes. The inner decoration favoured the First Empire and William Morris. For its size, the house was commodious. There were countless nooks resembling birds' nests, and little things made of silver were deposited like eggs. In this general perfection, two kinds of fastidiousness were at war. There lived here a mistress who would have dwelt daintily on a desert island, a master whose daintiness was, as it were, an investment, cultivated by the owner for his advancement, in accordance with the laws of competition. This competitive daintiness had caused Soames, in his Marlborough days, to be the first boy into white waistcoats in summer and corduroy waistcoats in winter, had prevented him from ever appearing in public with his tie climbing up his collar, and induced him to dust his patent leather boots before a great multitude assembled on speech day to hear him recite Molière. Skin-like immaculateness had grown over Soames, as over many Londoners. Impossible to conceive of him with a hair out of place, a tie deviating 1/8 of an inch from the perpendicular, a collar unglossed. He would not have gone without a bath for worlds. It was the fashion to take baths, and how bitter was his scorn of people who omitted them. But Irene could be imagined, like some nymph, bathing in wayside streams, for the joy of the freshness and of seeing her own fair body. In this conflict throughout the house, the woman had gone to the wall. As in the struggle between Saxon and Celt still going on within the nation, the more impressionable and receptive temperament had had forced on it a conventional superstructure. Thus the house had acquired a close resemblance to hundreds of other houses with the same high aspirations, having become "that very charming little house of the Soames Forsytes, quite individual, my dear, really elegant." For Soames Forsyte, Reed, James Peabody, Thomas Atkins, or Emmanuel Spagnoletti, the name, in fact, of any upper-middle-class Englishman in London with any pretensions to taste, and though the decoration be different, the phrase is just. On the evening of August the 8th, a week after the expedition to Robin Hill, in the dining-room of this house, quite individual, my dear, really elegant, Soames and Irene were seated at dinner. A hot dinner on Sundays was a little distinguishing elegance common to this house and many others. Early in married life Soames had laid down the rule: the servants must give us hot dinner on Sundays. They have nothing to do but play the concertina. The custom had produced no revolution, for, to Soames a rather deplorable sign, servants were devoted to Irene, who, in defiance of all safe tradition, appeared to recognise their right to a share in the weaknesses of human nature. The happy pair were seated not opposite each other, but rectangularly, at a handsome rosewood table. They dined without a cloth, a distinguishing elegance, and so far had not spoken a word. Soames liked to talk during dinner about business or what he had been buying, and so long as he talked, Irene's silence did not distress him. This evening he had found it impossible to talk. The decision to build had been weighing on his mind all the week, and he had made up his mind to tell her. His nervousness about this disclosure irritated him profoundly. She had no business to make him feel like that, a wife and a husband being one person. She had not looked at him once since they sat down, and he wondered what on earth she had been thinking about all the time. It was hard when a man worked as he did, making money for her, yes, and with an ache in his heart, that she should sit there looking as if she saw the walls of the room closing in. It was enough to make a man get up and leave the table. The light from the rose-shaded lamp fell on her neck and arms. Soames liked her to dine in a low dress. It gave him an inexpressible feeling of superiority to the majority of his acquaintance, whose wives were contented with their best high frocks or with tea-gowns when they dined at home. Under that rosy light her amber-coloured hair and fair skin made strange contrast with her dark brown eyes. Could a man own anything prettier than this dining-table with its deep tints, the starry soft-petalled roses, the ruby-coloured glass and quaint silver furnishing? Could a man own anything prettier than the woman who sat at it? Gratitude was no virtue among Forsytes, who, competitive and full of common sense, had no occasion for it, and Soames only experienced a sense of exasperation amounting to pain that he did not own her as it was his right to own her, that he could not, as by stretching out his hand to that rose, pluck her and sniff the very secrets of her heart. Out of his other property, out of all the things he had collected, his silver, his pictures, his houses, his investments, he got a secret and intimate feeling. Out of her he got none. In this house of his there was writing on every wall. His business-like temperament protested against a mysterious warning that she was not made for him. He had married this woman, conquered her, made her his own, and it seemed to him contrary to the most fundamental of all laws, the law of possession, that he could do no more than own her body, if indeed he could do that, which he was beginning to doubt. If anyone had asked him if he wanted to own her soul, the question would have seemed to him both ridiculous and sentimental. But he did so want, and the writing said he never would. She was ever silent, passive, gracefully averse, as though terrified lest by word, motion, or sign she might lead him to believe that she was fond of him, and he asked himself, must I always go on like this? Like most novel readers of his generation, and Soames was a great novel reader, literature coloured his view of life, and he had imbibed the belief that it was only a question of time. In the end, the husband always gained the affection of his wife. Even in those cases, a class of book he was not very fond of, which ended in tragedy, the wife always died with poignant regrets on her lips, or if it were the husband who died, unpleasant thought, threw herself on his body in an agony of remorse. He often took Irene to the theatre, instinctively choosing the modern society plays with the modern society conjugal problem, so fortunately different from any conjugal problem in real life. He found that they too always ended in the same way, even when there was a lover in the case. While he was watching the play, Soames often sympathised with the lover, but before he reached home again, driving with Irene in a hansom, he saw that this would not do, and he was glad the play had ended as it had. There was one class of husband that had just then come into fashion, the strong, rather rough, but extremely sound man, who was peculiarly successful at the end of the play. With this person Soames was really not in sympathy, and had it not been for his own position, would have expressed his disgust with the fellow. But he was so conscious of how vital to himself was the necessity for being a successful, even a strong husband, that he never spoke of a distaste born perhaps by the perverse processes of nature out of a secret fund of brutality in himself. But Irene's silence this evening was exceptional. He had never before seen such an expression on her face, and since it is always the unusual which alarms, Soames was alarmed. He ate his savoury, and hurried the maid as she swept off the crumbs with the silver sweeper. When she had left the room, he filled his glass with wine and said, "Anybody been here this afternoon?" "June." "What did she want?" It was an axiom with the Forsytes that people did not go anywhere unless they wanted something. "Came to talk about her lover, I suppose." Irene made no reply. "It looks to me," continued Soames, "as if she was sweeter on him than he is on her. She's always following him about." Irene's eyes made him feel uncomfortable. "You've no business to say such a thing," she exclaimed. "Why not? Anybody can see it." "They cannot, and if they could, it's disgraceful to say so." Soames's composure gave way. "You're a pretty wife," he said, but secretly he wondered at the heat of her reply. It was unlike her. "You're cracked about June. I can tell you one thing. Now she has the Buccaneer in tow, she doesn't care twopence about you, and you'll find it out. But you won't see so much of her in future. We're going to live in the country." He had been glad to get his news out under cover of this burst of irritation. He had expected a cry of dismay. The silence with which his pronouncement was received alarmed him. "You don't seem interested," he was obliged to add. "I knew it already." He looked at her sharply. "Who told you?" "June." "How did she know?" Irene did not answer. Baffled and uncomfortable, he said, "It's a fine thing for Bosinney. It'll be the making of him. I suppose she's told you all about it?" "Yes." There was another pause, and then Soames said, "I suppose you don't want to go?" Irene made no reply. "Well, I can't tell what you want. You never seem contented here." "Have my wishes anything to do with it?" She took the vase of roses and left the room. Soames remained seated. Was it for this that he'd signed that contract? Was it for this that he was going to spend some £10,000? Bosinney's phrase came back to him. Women are the devil. But presently he grew calmer. It might have been worse. She might have flared up. He had expected something more than this. It was lucky, after all, that June had broken the ice for him. She must have wormed it out of Bosinney. He might have known she would. He lighted his cigarette. After all, Irene had not made a scene. She would come round. That was the best of her. She was cold, but not sulky. And, puffing the cigarette smoke at a ladybird on the shining table, he plunged into a reverie about the house. It was no good worrying. He would go and make it up presently. She would be sitting out there in the dark under the Japanese sunshade, knitting. A beautiful, warm night. In truth, June had come in that afternoon with shining eyes and the words, "Soames is a brick. It's splendid for Phil. The very thing for him." Irene's face remaining dark and puzzled, she went on, "Your new house at Robin Hill, of course. What, don't you know?" Irene did not know. "Oh, then I suppose I shouldn't have told you." Looking impatiently at her friend, she cried, "You look as if you didn't care. Don't you see? It's what I've been praying for. The very chance he's been wanting all this time. Now you'll see what he can do." And thereupon she poured out the whole story. Since her own engagement she had not seemed much interested in her friend's position. The hours she spent with Irene were given to confidences of her own, and at times, for all her affectionate pity, it was impossible to keep out of her smile a trace of compassionate contempt for the woman who had made such a mistake in her life, such a vast, ridiculous mistake. "He's to have all the decorations as well. A free hand. It's perfect." June broke into laughter. Her little figure quivered gleefully. She raised her hand and struck a blow at a muslin curtain. "Do you know, I even asked Uncle James—" But with a sudden dislike to mentioning that incident she stopped, and presently, finding her friend so unresponsive, went away. She looked back from the pavement, and Irene was still standing in the doorway. In response to her farewell wave, Irene put her hand to her brow and, turning slowly, shut the door. Soames went to the drawing-room presently and peered at her through the window. Out in the shadow of the Japanese sunshade she was sitting very still, the lace on her white shoulders stirring with the soft rise and fall of her bosom. But about this silent creature, sitting there so motionless in the dark, there seemed a warmth, a hidden fervour of feeling, as if the whole of her being had been stirred, and some change were taking place in its very depths. He stole back to the dining-room, unnoticed. End of Part 1, Chapter 5. Part 1, Chapter 6 of The Man of Property. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Forsyte Saga, The Man of Property by John Galsworthy. Part 1, Chapter 6, James at Large. It was not long before Soames's determination to build went the round of the family, and created the flutter that any decision connected with property should make among Forsytes. It was not his fault, for he had been determined that no one should know. June, in the fullness of her heart, had told Mrs. Small, giving her leave only to tell Aunt Anne. She thought it would cheer her, the poor old sweet, for Aunt Anne had kept her room now for many days. Mrs. Small told Aunt Anne at once, who, smiling as she lay back on her pillows, said in her distinct, trembling old voice, "It's very nice for dear June, but I hope they will be careful. It's rather dangerous." When she was left alone again, a frown, like a cloud presaging a rainy morrow, crossed her face. While she was lying there so many days, the process of recharging her will went on all the time. It spread to her face, too, and tightening movements were always in action at the corners of her lips. The maid, Smither, who had been in her service since girlhood, and was spoken of as "Smither, a good girl, but so slow," the maid Smither performed every morning with extreme punctiliousness the crowning ceremony of that ancient toilet. Taking from the recesses of their pure white bandbox those flat grey curls, the insignia of personal dignity, she placed them securely in her mistress's hands and turned her back. And every day Aunts Julie and Hester were required to come and report on Timothy, what news there was of Nicholas, whether dear June had succeeded in getting Jolyon to shorten the engagement now that Mr. Bosinney was building Soames a house, whether young Roger's wife was really expecting, how the operation on Archie had succeeded, and what Swithin had done about that empty house in Wigmore Street, where the tenant had lost all his money and treated him so badly, above all about Soames. Was Irene still asking for a separate room? And every morning Smither was told, "I shall be coming down this afternoon, Smither, about 2 o'clock. I shall want your arm after all these days in bed." After telling Aunt Anne, Mrs. Small had spoken of the house in the strictest confidence to Mrs. Nicholas, who, in her turn, had asked Winifred Dartie for confirmation, supposing, of course, that, being Soames's sister, she would know all about it. Through her it had in due course come round to the ears of James. He had been a good deal agitated. Nobody, he said, told him anything, and rather than go direct to Soames himself, of whose taciturnity he was afraid, he took his umbrella and went round to Timothy's. He found Mrs. Septimus and Hester, who had been told, she was so safe she found it tiring to talk, ready and indeed eager to discuss the news. It was very good of dear Soames, they thought, to employ Mr. Bosinney, but rather risky. What had George named him? The Buccaneer? How droll! But George was always droll. However, it would be all in the family. They supposed that they must really look upon Mr. Bosinney as belonging to the family, though it seemed strange. James here broke in. "Nobody knows anything about him. I don't see what Soames wants with a young man like that. I shouldn't be surprised if Irene had put her oar in. I shall speak to—" "Soames," interposed Aunt Julie, "told Mr. Bosinney that he didn't wish it mentioned. He wouldn't like it to be talked about, I'm sure, and if Timothy knew he would be very vexed. James put his hand behind his ear. "What?" he said. "I'm getting very deaf. I suppose I don't hear people. Emily's got a bad toe. We shan't be able to start for Wales till the end of the month. There's always something." And, having got what he wanted, he took his hat and went away. It was a fine afternoon, and he walked across the park towards Soames's, where he intended to dine, for Emily's toe kept her in bed, and Rachel and Cicely were on visit in the country. He took the slanting path from the Bayswater side of the Row to the Knightsbridge gate, across a pasture of short burnt grass dotted with blackened sheep, strewn with seated couples and strange waifs lying prone on their faces, like corpses on a field over which the wave of battle has rolled. He walked rapidly, his head bent, looking neither to the right nor left. The appearance of this park, the centre of his own battlefield, where he had all his life been fighting, excited no thought or speculation in his mind. These corpses flung down there from out the press and turmoil of the struggle, these pairs of lovers sitting cheek by jowl for an hour of idle Elysium, snatched from the monotony of their treadmill, awakened no fancies in his mind. He had outlived that kind of imagination. His nose, like the nose of a sheep, was fastened to the pastures on which he browsed. One of his tenants had lately shown a disposition to be behindhand in his rent, and it had become a grave question whether he had not better turn him out at once, and so run the risk of not reletting before Christmas. Swithin had just been let in very badly, but it had served him right. He'd held on too long. He pondered this as he walked steadily, holding his umbrella carefully by the wood, just below the crook of the handle, so as to keep the ferrule off the ground and not fray the silk in the middle. And with his thin, high shoulders stooped, his long legs moving with swift mechanical precision, this passage through the park, where the sun shone with a clear flame on so much idleness, on so many human evidences of the remorseless battle of property raging beyond its ring, was like the flight of some land bird across the sea. He felt a touch on his arm as he came out at Albert Gate. It was Soames, who, crossing from the shady side of Piccadilly, where he had been walking home from the office, had suddenly appeared alongside. "Your mother's in bed," said James. "I was just coming to you, but I suppose I shall be in the way." The outward relations between James and his son were marked by a lack of sentiment peculiarly Forsytean, But for all that, the two were by no means unattached. Perhaps they regarded one another as an investment. Certainly they were solicitous of each other's welfare, glad of each other's company. They had never exchanged two words upon the more intimate problems of life, or revealed in each other's presence the existence of any deep feeling. Something beyond the power of word analysis bound them together, something hidden deep in the fibre of nations and families, for blood, they say, is thicker than water, and neither of them was a cold-blooded man. Indeed, in James, love of his children was now the prime motive of his existence. To have creatures who were parts of himself, to whom he might transmit the money he saved, was at the root of his saving, and at 75, what was left that could give him pleasure but saving? The kernel of life was in this saving for his children. Than James Forsyte, notwithstanding all his Jonah-isms, there was no saner man, if the leading symptom of sanity, as we are told, is self-preservation, though without doubt Timothy went too far, in all this London, of which he owned so much, and loved with such a dumb love as the centre of his opportunities. He had the marvellous instinctive sanity of the middle class. In him, more than in Jolyon with his masterful will and his moments of tenderness and philosophy, more than in Swithin the martyr to crankiness, Nicholas the sufferer from ability, and Roger the victim of enterprise, beat the true pulse of compromise. Of all the brothers he was the least remarkable in mind and person, and for that reason more likely to live for ever. To James, more than to any of the others, was the family significant and dear. There had always been something primitive and cosy in his attitude towards life. He loved the family hearth, he loved gossip, and he loved grumbling. All his decisions were formed of a cream which he skimmed off the family mind, and, through that family, off the minds of thousands of other families of similar fibre. Year after year, week after week, he went to Timothy's, and in his brother's front drawing-room, his legs twisted, his long white whiskers framing his clean-shaven mouth, would sit watching the family pot simmer, the cream rising to the top, and he would go away sheltered, refreshed, comforted, with an indefinable sense of comfort. Beneath the adamant of his self-preserving instinct there was much real softness in James. A visit to Timothy's was like an hour spent in the lap of a mother, and the deep craving he himself had for the protection of the family wing reacted in turn on his feelings towards his own children. It was a nightmare to him to think of them exposed to the treatment of the world in money, health, or reputation. When his old friend John Street's son volunteered for special service, he shook his head querulously and wondered what John Street was about to allow it. And when young Street was assegaied, he took it so much to heart that he made a point of calling everywhere with the special object of saying he knew how it would be, he'd no patience with them. When his son-in-law, Darty, had that financial crisis due to speculation in oil shares, James made himself ill worrying over it. The knell of all prosperity seemed to have sounded. It took him 3 months, and a visit to Baden-Baden, to get better. There was something terrible in the idea that but for his, James's, money, Darty's name might have appeared in the bankruptcy list. Composed of a physiological mixture so sound that if he had an earache he thought he was dying, he regarded the occasional ailments of his wife and children as in the nature of personal grievances, special interventions of Providence for the purpose of destroying his peace of mind. But he did not believe at all in the ailments of people outside his own immediate family, affirming them in every case to be due to neglected liver. His universal comment was, "What can they expect? I'll have it myself if I'm not careful." When he went to Soames's that evening, he felt that life was hard on him. There was Emily with a bad toe, and Rachel gadding about in the country. He got no sympathy from anybody, and Anne, she was ill. He did not believe she would last through the summer. He had called there 3 times now without her being able to see him. And this idea of Soames's building a house, that would have to be looked into. As to the trouble with Irene, he didn't know what was to come of that. Anything might come of it. He entered 62 Montpellier Square with the fullest intentions of being miserable. It was already 7:30, and Irene, dressed for dinner, was seated in the drawing-room. She was wearing her gold-coloured frock, for, having been displayed at a dinner-party, a soirée, and a dance, it was now to be worn at home, and she had adorned the bosom with a cascade of lace, on which James's eyes riveted themselves at once. "Where do you get your things?" he said in an aggravated voice. "I never see Rachel and Cicely looking half so well. That rose point now, that's not real." Irene came close to prove to him that he was in error, and, in spite of himself, James felt the influence of her deference, of the faint seductive perfume exhaling from her. No self-respecting Forsyte surrendered at a blow, so he merely said he didn't know, he expected she was spending a penny on dress. The gong sounded, and, putting her white arm within his, Irene took him into the dining-room. She seated him in Soames's usual place round the corner on her left. The light fell softly there, so that he would not be worried by the gradual dying of the day, and she began to talk to him about himself. Presently over James came a change, like the mellowing that steals upon a fruit in the sun, a sense of being caressed and praised and petted, and all without the bestowal of a single caress or word of praise. He felt that what he was eating was agreeing with him. He could not get that feeling at home. He did not know when he had enjoyed a glass of champagne so much, and, on enquiring the brand and price, was surprised to find that it was one of which he had a large stock himself, but could never drink. He instantly formed the resolution to let his wine merchant know that he had been swindled. Looking up from his food, he remarked, "You've a lot of nice things about the place. Now, what did you give for that sugar-sifter? Shouldn't wonder if it was worth money." He was particularly pleased with the appearance of a picture on the wall opposite, which he himself had given them. "I'd no idea it was so good," he said. They rose to go into the drawing-room, and James followed Irene closely. "That's what I call a capital little dinner," he murmured, breathing pleasantly down on her shoulder. "Nothing heavy and not too Frenchified, but I can't get it at home. I pay my cook £60 a year, but she can't give me a dinner like that." He had as yet made no allusion to the building of the house, nor did he when Soames, pleading the excuse of business, betook himself to the room at the top where he kept his pictures. James was left alone with his daughter-in-law. The glow of the wine and of an excellent liqueur was still within him. He felt quite warm toward her. She was really a taking little thing. She listened to you and seemed to understand what you were saying, and, while talking, he kept examining her figure, from her bronze-coloured shoes to the waved gold of her hair. She was leaning back in an Empire chair, her shoulders poised against the top, her body, flexibly straight and unsupported from the hips, swaying when she moved, as though giving to the arms of a lover. Her lips were smiling, her eyes half closed. It may have been a recognition of danger in the very charm of her attitude, or a twang of digestion, that caused a sudden dumbness to fall on James. He did not remember ever having been quite alone with Irene before, and, as he looked at her, an odd feeling crept over him, as though he had come across something strange and foreign. Now what was she thinking about, sitting back like that? Thus, when he spoke, it was in a sharper voice, as if he had been awakened from a pleasant dream. "What do you do with yourself all day?" he said. "You never come round to Park Lane." She seemed to be making very lame excuses, and James did not look at her. He did not want to believe that she was really avoiding them. It would mean too much. "I expect the fact is you haven't time," he said. "You're always about with June. I expect you're useful to her with her young man, chaperoning and one thing and another. They tell me she's never at home now. Your Uncle Jolyon, he doesn't like it, I fancy, being left so much alone as he is.
They tell me she's always hanging about for this young Bosinney. I suppose he comes here every day. Now, what do you think of him? Do you think he knows his own mind? He seems to me a poor thing. I should say the grey mare was the better horse."
The colour deepened in Irene's face, and James watched her suspiciously. "Perhaps you don't quite understand Mr. Bosinney," she said.
"Don't understand him?" James hurried out. "Why not? You can see he's one of these artistic chaps. They say he's clever. They all think they're clever. You know more about him than I do," he added, and again his suspicious glance rested on her.
"He is designing a house for Soames," she said softly, evidently trying to smooth things over.
"That brings me to what I was going to say," continued James. "I don't know what Soames wants with a young man like that. Why doesn't he go to a first-rate man?"
"Perhaps Mr. Bosinney is first-rate." James rose and took a turn with bent head.
"That's it," he said. "You young people, you all stick together. You all think you know best."
Halting his tall, lank figure before her, he raised a finger and levelled it at her bosom, as though bringing an indictment against her beauty.
"All I can say is, these artistic people, or whatever they call themselves, they're as unreliable as they can be, and my advice to you is this: don't you have too much to do with him."
Irene smiled, and in the curve of her lips was a strange provocation. She seemed to have lost her deference. Her breast rose and fell as though with secret anger. She drew her hands inward from their rest on the arms of her chair, until the tips of her fingers met, and her dark eyes looked unfathomably at James. The latter gloomily scrutinized the floor.
"I'll tell you my opinion," he said. "It's a pity you haven't got a child to think about and occupy you."
A brooding look came instantly on Irene's face, and even James became conscious of the rigidity that took possession of her whole figure beneath the softness of its silk and lace clothing. He was frightened by the effect he had produced, and, like most men with but little courage, he sought at once to justify himself by bullying.
"You don't seem to care what's going about. Why don't you drive down to Hurlingham with us, and go to the theatre now and then? At your time of life you ought to take an interest in things. You're a young woman."
The brooding look darkened on her face. He grew nervous.
"Well, I know nothing about it," he said. "Nobody tells me anything. Soames ought to be able to take care of himself. If he can't take care of himself, he mustn't look to me. That's all."
Biting the corner of his forefinger, he stole a cold, sharp look at his daughter-in-law. He encountered her eyes fixed on his own, so dark and deep that he stopped, and broke into a gentle perspiration.
"Well, I must be going," he said after a short pause,
and a minute later rose with a slight appearance of surprise, as though he had expected to be asked to stop. Giving his hand to Irene, he allowed himself to be conducted to the door and let out into the street. He would not have a cab, he would walk. Irene was to say good night to Soames for him, and if she wanted a little gaiety, well, he would drive her down to Richmond any day. He walked home, and, going upstairs, woke Emily out of the first sleep she had had for 24 hours, to tell her that it was his impression things were in a bad way at Soames's. On this theme he descanted for half an hour, until at last, saying that he would not sleep a wink, he turned on his side and instantly began to snore. In Montpellier Square, Soames, who had come from the picture-room, stood invisible at the top of the stairs, watching Irene sort the letters brought by the last post. She turned back into the drawing-room, but in a minute came out and stood as if listening. Then she came stealing up the stairs with a kitten in her arms. He could see her face bent over the little beast, which was purring against her neck. Why couldn't she look at him like that? Suddenly she saw him, and her face changed. "Any letters for me?" he said. "3." He stood aside, and without another word she passed on into the bedroom. End of Part 1, Chapter 6.